Was hunting in the 90s better than it is today? It's an interesting question. The 90s were different. I was 12 years old, but those were formidable years. Hunting was just different in the 90s, you know? Just had a different feel. The wilderness was completely unknown. Didn't have trail cameras and stuff, and frankly, you didn't know what was up there. Bigfoot was probably real for sure. At least that's how we all felt. So, like, you got lost in the woods in the early 2000s, the 90s, really any time pre-cell phone. Horrifying time. Come along as we walk back on this nostalgic journey of not a ton of big bucks getting killed. I didn't start hunting until 95 or so. Started killing squirrels, killed the fire out of squirrels. One year, my brother Ryan and me, we killed 64 squirrels. And I know because I tallied them up on my little composition notebook. In the 8th grade, Mrs. Matthews, an absolute psycho, with a red pen. And she goes, "Oh, that's pretty. What's that, Ricky?" Ha ha ha. And I said, each one represents a squirrel's life that me and my brother took. Yeah, anyways, that didn't fly too good. But the if it's brown, it's down thing that like your uncle and your dad and your grandpas would say, I mean, we meant that. You didn't just say that. You weren't messing around. If a fawn walked out in front of you, you shot it. If a button buck walked out in front of you, you shot it. You shot it until it stopped moving. Maybe people out there will disagree. Tell me if you disagree. We didn't see very many deer growing up. We just didn't see that many. And we're watching like Michael Waddell and Bill Jordan and all these guys on Saturday mornings, and they've just got buck after buck. Our woods weren't like that. Our woods were full of squirrels, and we had a handful of does. But another key difference between 2025, or whenever you're watching this, in the 90s, about half of those guys would look at you and say, "Oh yeah, 146-inch deer up there, and it's the biggest deer you've ever seen that's not in a Cabela's." And he'll just go, yeah, I shot that at 3 a.m, right out of the truck. Buddy had a spotlight, and it was my turn to shoot, and there he was, like he was always every night, and we just waited for the velvet to fall off. You heard stories like that. You heard people come to school and say they found an enormous deer body and the head cut off on the side of their driveway. I mean, you heard stuff like that. I don't know about you. I don't hear stuff like that anymore. I'm sure there are people that do it, but I mean, they're probably also the same guys that, Christmas Eve are breaking into a trailer park. I mean, that's the kind of guys that poach today. Back then, it wasn't just those kind of guys. Maybe like people you went to church with, people you really respected. Yeah, he tasted like crap, so we just we didn't even cut him up. We just cut his head off, kept horns. I mean, I feel like I've heard that so many times. It was normalized, but my family, we could never do it. My dad was so strict about, if the limit was 4 squirrels, you killed 4 squirrels. You didn't kill a 5th squirrel. We never broke a rule. There were no trail cameras back then, so nobody really knew what was going on. Everything was like a myth. You'd hear about Whitey, the massive white-horned buck that lived in this dark holler, or this albino Boone and Crockett buck that was, over 10 years old. Everybody's grandpa used to watch. Stepping into the woods and being a little scared because you didn't know what was out there. That was certainly an aspect of it. These were also before the days of cell phones. So if you got lost, you had to figure out where you were. You had to figure out where was north, where was east, where was your truck. Once cell phones rolled around, that really kind of started changing things. Then you started getting text messages about guys falling out of homemade tree stands and stuff, which probably helped eliminate most homemade tree stands. If you've never sat on a 5-gallon bucket on top of a pallet, and the pallet is nailed to a 200-year-old oak tree, roughly 26 feet up the oak tree, if you've never sat in one of those kind of stands that your uncle, that your dad hung 20 years before the day you're sitting in it, I don't know if you hunted pre-2000s. You had to get in one of those tree stands, and they were horrifying. And I don't know. There's no way today I would ever get in one of those stands. And, I mean, I think it's great that people aren't really building those anymore. If you're building homemade tree stands, just stop doing that. They are so cheap and so much safer. Just order something online. Get a tree stand. That's psychotic. Don't nail 2x4s to a tree and sit on them and hunt. Just don't do that. In Ohio, opening day of gun season, schools are shut down. My whole life, up until recently, every school got Monday of deer season off. Tuesday of deer season, for the boys that did come to school, the cafeteria was on fire with insane deer hunting stories from these like 13, 14-year-old boys. But some of the stories you would hear in the school cafeteria were crazy. There was just something culturally different about hunters back then. Not everybody, not by any stretch, but such a bigger majority than there is today. I feel like you don't really hear stories like that often, where guys are on their own land and they find a headless carcass. You just don't hear stuff like that anymore. But man, when I was a kid, you would hear that every year, year after year. It's kind of funny though, because if you look back at the statistics, and I just looked at 2023 and 1993, and I looked at how many deer were harvested in Ohio, and it was a huge difference. It was 100,000 deer difference. 1993, Ohioans harvested just over 138,000 deer. In 2023, Ohioans harvested 238,000 deer. So I don't know if we've gotten better at hunting deer, if deer hunting has just gotten easier because of technology, but I don't know if I'm buying the whole hunters are a dying breed. So I don't know if there are less and less deer hunters every year. I know you hear that a lot. I don't know how much I buy that, but I do know that there is a limited amount of public land that happens to shrink every once in a while. That's not getting bigger. Yeah, I don't know if hunters are dwindling. In fact, I feel like so many of my friends who never hunted have recently picked up hunting. But I find that whole conversation very interesting. When you were a kid, going hunting was like the best day of the year. Holidays were cool. Christmas was great. Going to the beach was great. I mean, there's not a lot of things better than going to the beach as a kid. You know, that's a pretty sweet gig. But going deer hunting at 13 years old, best day of the year. Nothing beats that. A button buck walks out at 40 yards. You've got a 20 gauge in your hand. There's nothing cooler. There's nothing more fun than that. And, you know, back then, shooting a button buck or shooting a doe, that was something to be celebrated. And I think a lot of people still have that today, but I feel like kind of as a hunting culture, we have certainly lost a lot of that. Remember how we used to treat that meat like gold, too? Man, back in the day, that was just precious. You only cooked it for special meals. Now, we did soak it a lot. Soaked it in salt water, soaked it in milk, different stuff like that. If you are doing that, please stop doing that. That's so crazy. I mean, we just didn't know any better. Nobody knew any better back then. But we all have the internet now. Stop soaking your deer meat. Would you buy an expensive ribeye and soak it in a gallon Ziploc bag of ice water for 24 hours? No way. Absolutely don't do it with your deer meat. So in conclusion, I don't know if the 90s were better, but man, the 90s and the early 2000s were awesome. And it was a great time to hunt. And I think we've lost a bunch of that because of technology and stuff. We've lost a lot of the mystery. But I still think it's good to try to focus on hunting with friends and family and making those memories together. I know I'm really bad about just solo hunting all the time. But last year, my dad, my brother, and I, we got to hunt. My good friend Andy came down and hunted with me. And I'm going to try to do a lot more of that. So thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Cheers.